Today's daf we're going to be learning is Zevachim daf Kuf. Today's daf is sponsored by Debbie and Yossi Gvir in honor of the birth of Hillel Shai, son of Renana and Boaz Ordman. The name Hillel naturally evokes the figure of Hillel the elder, representing the revelation of Torah in a world of listening and respect. The letters of the name Hillel reflect praise to Hashem, with the hope that we should continue to recognize and appreciate light and beauty, even amid the complexities of existence and war. Today's daf is sponsored by the Hadron Women of Long Island in honor of the engagement of Yoni Savitsky, son of our friend and daf learner Cheryl Savitsky, to Yakira Wolfson. The Yoni and Yakira build a bayit in Hema B'Yisrael and the foundations of Torah, Avodah, and Gemilut Chasadim you have so lovingly imparted, and may we all continue to share smachot. Mazal tov to everyone, and we will get started. So today's daf, I will warn you, is a bit of a complicated daf, but the structure is kind of simple. It's just we're going to get off on a few side things. So because of that, I made a study guide to help us keep everything organized. So I'll just start with a bit of introductory words, and I'll share my screen right now. The background to the whole issue of aninut and the kesher between aninut and not eating kodshim comes from one major pasuk, and then we're going to see one other pasuk which we're going to relate to later, which is this whole section, and we're going to talk about it more in tomorrow's daf, which is with Aharon and Moshe on the 8th day of the Miluim after Aharon's sons died. Aaron tells Moshe, "Hena yom ekrivu et chatatam ve'etolatam lefnei Hashem v'tikreno oti ka'ela v'achalti chatat hayom yitav b'nei Hashem." He says, we brought the sacrifice, but are you going to call? Okay, we're going to understand this pasuk a little better later. But would it be appropriate? In other words, Moshe gets all upset. Why did you burn the chatat? And he said, would it be appropriate if I ate the chatat? Would that be appropriate in the eyes of God while I'm in onen? So obviously, I'm in onen. I can't eat the meat of the sin offering, right? And any offering for all intents and purposes. So that's the first pasuk where it seems to be clear that you can't eat kodshim when you're in onen, right? Which again means the day, well, we're going to see, okay? The day the person dies, we saw already a machloket. Does it continue into the night as well or not? Or everyone agreed it continues into the night. The question is it by Torah law or rabbinic law? And then we have this pasuk in Amos, which says in chapter 8, verse 10, Hafachti chagechem la'evel, your happy days will turn into sad days, and your shirim tekina, instead of singing, you'll be singing lamentations, and blah, blah, blah. And then you're going to be like an avel yachid, va'acharita ki yom mar. And basically what they understand is that the bitterness is the length of a day. Okay, so from here they're going to get that it's a complete day, okay, whether that means complete day, or day into the night. Okay? So now what we saw, that's just a little bit of background. What we saw yesterday's daf was that there's a baraitot where Rabbi Shimon disagrees with Rabbi Yehuda about whether this issue of aninut goes into the night is by Torah law or rabbinic law. Rabbi Shimon said, I'll prove to you, he says to Rabbi Yehuda, who says it's by Torah law, that no, in onen einam midivrei Torah ela midivrei sofrim. Aninut that goes into the night, in other words, again, the day of aninut is by Torah law. But that night, already, it's only by rabbinic law that in onen can't eat sacrificial meat. How do I know that? Because he says, they said, because they allowed the onen to eat the korban Pesach at night. If you're an onen on the 14th, you can eat the korban Pesach on the 15th at night. Okay? And there's my proof that it must be rabbinic, because if it was Torah law, we wouldn't override that. Okay. That's Rabbi Shimon in the baraitot. But in Rabbi Shimon in a different baraitot, okay, and that's what we saw in yesterday's daf, Rabbi Shimon in a different baraitot says, in onen can't eat shlamim. That's what we learn it from, because you're not at peace, and therefore you can't eat. You have to be only shalem, at peace. You don't bring it when you're in onen. And then Rabbi Shimon proceeded to say, not only shlamim, also ola, also chatat, also this, also that, also b'chor maaser and Pesach. So, what do you see from here? You can't eat the Pesach if you're in onen. So one pasuk says you can, and one pasuk says you can't, right? One pasuk says you can eat the Pesach. The other pasuk says you can't eat the Pesach. So can you eat the Pesach? Can you eat the Pesach? That's the contradiction. So here we have in our chart, right? Can the onen eat the Pesach? According to Rabbi Shimon in the first baraitot, yes. According to Rabbi Shimon in the second baraitot, no. We had 2 answers so far. We're going to have another 3 today. So we're going to end up, and that's, if I want to keep you with the structure of the daf so you don't get lost. Our structure of the daf, the basic structure of our daf is going to be these 5 answers. We're going to then get off on tangents on each of the 3 answers. In other words, the first 2 we're done with already, but I'll review them. The next three we're going to go delve into today. And from there, everywhere we get off is going to come off of one of these three answers, and in order. We're going to do the third answer, have a difficulty. Then we're going to do the fourth answer. We're going to have a proof that this distinction that Abaye makes in the fourth answer is we see from somewhere else. And then we're going to go to Rava, and then we're going to have to find something he says that we're going to ask a difficulty on, answer it, and then say, oh, where do we get that from? And we're going to have a whole tangent off of that, okay, which is going to then lead to another tangent. So we'll basically go tangent on tangent. Okay, but the basic structure of these 5 resolutions to how to resolve this contradiction between Rabbi Shimon in one baraitot saying onen eats the Pesach, to Rabbi Shimon in the second baraitot saying an onen doesn't eat the Pesach. So the first answer is a very easy one, also the first 2, which basically neutralize the second baraitot. The first says, Rav Chisda said, Pesach kedei nasbe. It just mentioned Pesach by accident kind of thing. Because Bechor, Maaser, and Pesach are a threesome, and accidentally mentioned it, so, just ignore it. It was by mistake. The second one says it doesn't really mean the Korban Pesach. The Korban Pesach, of course, can be eaten. When it says Pesach, it meant the Shlamim that go along with the Korban Pesach. Okay, that's how we resolved our first 2 things. Now we're going to start with the last 3 words of Tzadi Teramubet. Rav Meri Amar. Rav Meri comes with a third answer. Now, the first 2 answers basically just neutralized the second source and went with the first source. So the first source is true. Of course, he eats the Pesach. Now we're going to have 3 answers where each time we're going to say each source is talking about a different situation. Okay, but then each answer is going to be a different kind of thing. Lo kashya. Kan shemet lo meit ba'arba'a asar, ukvaro ba'arba'a asar. Kan shemet lo meit b'shlosha asar, ukvaro ba'arba'a asar. Now this is a theme we're going to see later on in the daf as well. There's a difference between the aninut on the day of the death and an aninut on the day of the burial. Now the day of the death could be the day of the burial. When we say the day of the burial, we mean the day of the burial when it doesn't occur on the day of the death. We already saw this distinction in the previous daf, and now we're going to go into it again. So meit lo meit ba'arba'asar ukvaro ba'arba'asar. So if the day of death is the day of burial is the day of death, then that's going to be much more strict because we're in the day of death. The day of death is when the real aninut is by Torah law. That's what Aaron was talking about, right? It was the day his sons died. So yom mitah tofes le'lo midoraita. On a day like that, the day of death, the aninut is going to continue and be by Torah law, even according to Rabbi Shimon, okay? Because we're trying to explain Rabbi Shimon. So even though Rabbi Shimon disagreed with Rabbi Yehuda and said, Rabbi Yehuda said it's Doraita and Rabbi Shimon said it's Dorabanan, now we're going to say, actually, Rabbi Shimon thinks that if it's the day of death, the aninut continues through the night, even on a Torah level. But but if the person died on the 13th of Nisan and the burial wasn't until the next day, then you can eat the Pesach. Why? Because then Yom Kfura de Rabbanan, since the aninut anyway on the day of the burial, which doesn't occur on the day of death, is only rabbinic, and therefore the Pesach overrides. Okay, sounds like a good answer, but there's a major problem with this answer. Amar le Rav Ashi the Rav Meri. Rav Ashi says to Rav Meri, this can't possibly be, because let's go back to that baraitot with Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda. What happened? Rabbi Yehuda said aninut is by Torah law. And what did Rabbi Shimon say? Aninut is only rabbinic. How do I know? Because the onen can eat the Pesach. Now, what did we just say? Well, the onen can eat the Pesach only if it was the day of the burial, not the day of the death. So, Had Katani Amarla Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon says to Rabbi Yehuda as a response, Teda, look, I'm going to prove my point. You should know I'm right because Sharei Amru onen v'ochel tovel v'ochel pischo la'erev avalo b'kodeshim. The fact that they said the onen can eat the Korban Pesach proves that I'm right. Name Ale Rabbi Yehuda could say to him, Kamina lach ana yom mita deoraita va'atamar li yom kfura de Rabbanan. If that source that Rabbi Shimon says, what do you mean? Of course it's rabbinic. It's talking about not the day of death, but the day of the burial when it occurs not on the day of death. And now that's not the case. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees and says it's by Torah law on the day of the death. So Rabbi Yehuda can respond to him, you're talking apples, I'm talking oranges, right? We're not talking about the same thing. I'm giving you a case of, and as I was talking about, the day of death is by Torah law. And you're answering me by saying, oh, well, the onen can eat the Pesach when it's after the day of the burial that didn't occur on the day of the death. And it's them, they're talking, right, not at each other. They're talking about completely different things. So that doesn't really make sense. In fact, they say kasha. Yeah, Rav Meri's answer is very weak. Okay, that doesn't really work. Okay, now we're going to go to Abaye's answer. Now I want you to note we're near the top of Amud Aleph. till the end of Amud Aleph is just going to be Abaye's answer and dealing with a proof for Abaye's answer. Only after that, we're going to get back to the fifth answer, which is Rava. Okay, so again, there's 5 answers altogether. Today we're doing 3 because we already had 2 yesterday. But we're going to get off on this 4th answer. Abaye Amar, lo kasha, kan shemet kodem chatzot, kan shemet lachar chatzot. Did the person's relative die before midday or after midday? Why is that relevant? Well, what happens at midday on the 14th of Nisan, on Erev Pesach? That's when your obligation to bring the Korban Pesach kicks in. Because before that, you're not, right? I mean, you're obviously obligated, but the obligation hasn't begun. So now how are we going to work this out? Kodem chatzot deloi chaze lePesach. If the person died before chatzot, where you never became obligated in Korban Pesach, because what happened? Before the obligation for Korban Pesach kicked in, you're already an onen. So what happens now? Chayle ale aninut. So your aninut kicks in before your obligation to bring the Korban Pesach. If so, aninut takes over. In onen, can't eat kodshim even that night. So therefore you don't eat. And therefore you don't do the Pesach. But achar chatzot, but if the person died after midday, where the obligation, the chaze lePesach, you already had the obligation. Chaze means ra'oi. Okay, the root chazeh means to see, like the word chazon is a vision. Okay, chaze means to see, but ra'oi and ra'eh is similar, right? That you could have brought the Pesach. Okay, it was a time that was potentially relevant for Pesach. Then lo chayle alei ninut. First, your Korban Pesach already kicked in. So when you become an onen later, that's not relevant. That doesn't matter. Okay, when you become an onen later, your aninut gets pushed off basically until you eat the Korban Pesach, because the Korban Pesach obligation happened first. So that's Abaye's answer. Now, like I told you, we're going to now leave this chart and move to the next chart, which is Abaye now wants to prove the Gemara wants to prove Abaye's distinction. How do we know that there's a distinction whether the person died before Chatzot or after Chatzot? To answer this question, we're going to go to a different contradiction. Today is full of contradictions and resolutions to the contradictions. So here's our contradiction. Ditanya. We're going to start with a pasuk. The first source is a pasuk about a Kohen. A regular Kohen is not allowed to become impure to dead people. However, there's certain relatives, mother, father, brother, sister, wife, right, where the Kohen can become impure to them. Now the pasuk lists them all, and after listing them all, in the next pasuk it says, La'achoto habetula, okay, only if she's still a virgin, unmarried. Hakrovai lava shaloi taleish la yitama, la with a hey. To her he can become impure. So the first drasha is like this: la yitama. To her he becomes impure. Mitzvah. What do you learn from here? It's a mitzvah, meaning he should do it, not just okay if you want you can, but you should. Lo ratza, and to the extent that, what if he doesn't want to? Mitam'in oto al korcho. We force him. We say, you must become impure to your sister. U'maaseh b'Yosef HaKohen, shemeta ishto be'erev HaPesach. V'lo ratza litameh. There was a case with Yosef HaKohen, his wife died in Erev Pesach, and he didn't want to become impure. Why not? Because if he became impure, he wouldn't be able to bring the Korban Pesach. So he didn't want to. What did he do? Nimnu echav HaKohanim v'timu ba'al korcho. His brothers, the Kohanim, forced him to basically become impure to her. They said, no, you have to become impure to your wife, and there's nothing you can do. Now, this seems to imply that it's a little bit tricky what's going on here, and I'm going to start with Rashi, although I'll bring in something that Tosfot says after, because there is a bit of a difficulty in this whole sugya that I struggled with, and Tosfot really responded to it, so I'll share that with you soon. But let's just go with Rashi right now. What we're saying here is, they forced Yosef HaKohen to become impure. Why? Because he was an onen anyway. He couldn't even bring the Korban Pesach if he wanted. Because there's 2 issues here. One is becoming tameh, right? And once you're tameh, you can't bring the Korban Pesach. But the other is that you're an onen and you can't even bring the Korban Pesach anyway. Because if you're an onen, right, what did we say? You have to be in a state of peace, shalem, not onen where you're upset and sad. So basically they said, oh, you can't bring the Pesach anyway. So obviously you have to become impure to her. Now, Urimini, this contradicts the following source. Now it's a little bit tricky because this source, and we're going to see in a few minutes, we're going to read the entire source. Right now we're just reading the end of it. This source is talking about the psukim or a nazir. Now a nazir, there's different laws than the Kohen, and that's why it's a little tricky. A Nazir actually can't become impure to any of those relatives that the Kohen can be, and neither can a Kohen Gadol. Okay? Now, Rashi says here that we're even talking about a Kohen Gadol who's a Nazir, and that you'll see why Rashi says that, because of the baraitot, the way the baraitot beforehand goes. But I don't want to get you too confused right now. But let's say we go with Rashi right now. Ula achoto. So now this pasuk says, la'achoto, okay, la'aviv, le'imo, la'achiv, la'achoto. Okay, in a few minutes we're going to see. The baraitot starts by darshaning all of those words. Why does it say father, mother, brother, sister? Lo yitameh lahem. Now here the lo is with an aleph. You cannot become impure to them. Okay? B'motam, when they die. So now the drasha is going to be, why does it say all four of these? But now we're up to the achoto. Matamud lamal. What is this coming to teach you? Ula achoto, I'm sorry, I lost my place for a second. Okay. Ula achoto, matamud lamar. Hare shalach lishchot et pischo v'lamula pino. What if he's on his way to do the Korban Pesach or to do a Brit Milah? Now these are the two that you get kared for not doing mitzvot aseh, okay? Now, so you're about to do a Brit Milah or lishchot Pesach v'shama shemet lo meit, and all of a sudden you hear that someone died in your family. Yachol yitama, you might have thought you could become impure to them. Amart lo yitama. It says no, you can't. Okay, you're not allowed to. Yachol. Now, what does this mean? Okay, just to be very clear, it means you bring the Korban Pesach. Now, how can you bring the Korban Pesach if you're an onen? Didn't we just say onen can't bring the Pesach anyway? So that's the basic contradiction here. Okay, before we continue with the baraitot, that's the idea here. It sounds like you bring the Korban Pesach even though you're an onen. Now, what's difficult about this commentary is that this whole pasuk is talking about a Nazir, and we're comparing it to, like, you could just simply say, oh, the Nazir can't become impure to her because he's a Nazir, and he's not allowed to, and maybe he's even a Nazir and a Kohen Gadol, like Rashi says, and then, double reason, all the more so, versus a regular Kohen. So Tosfot brings up that problem, and Tosfot basically says that actually this line in the Nazir, okay, Aviv, Imo, Achoto, those are, Aviv, Imo, and Achiv, are all words that are coming to talk about Nazir cases. But why is there this additional word, lachoto? It's actually talking about a regular person. Okay, and this makes a lot more sense in the context of the sugya. A regular person who's on his way to do, or on her way to do the Korban Pesach, or to give a Brit Milah to their son, and they hear they have a dead family member, and they cannot become impure. They actually have to do the Korban Pesach. Okay? And then it's saying, now either which way we look at it, whether it's talking about a regular person or a Kohen Gadol who's a Nazir or just a Nazir, either which way it seems to be saying that aninut has no relevance here. Even though you're an onen, you could still eat the Korban Pesach. Okay, that's the problem. Now we're just going to get off, but I want to be clear before we get here. So the first source basically says they forced Yosef Cohen to become impure because anyway, he couldn't do the Korban Pesach. He was an onen. Onen can't eat the Korban Pesach. And the second source says, you don't become impure. You go do your Korban Pesach. So it sounds like an onen can eat the Korban Pesach. So what's the only resolution? We're going to see, Kodem Chatzot La'achar Chatzot. That's where we're going to go. Okay? But we'll get there in a minute. Okay? Now we're just going to finish the baraitot. This isn't relevant for our purposes. Yachol kashem shelo yitameh lachoto kachem mitameh lemeit mitzvah. Now, you might have thought, well, not only your sister can a Nazir not become impure to, but maybe also, or again, you're on your way to do the Korban Pesach, and we say, no, don't become impure to your relative. You have to finish the Korban Pesach first. Maybe if it's a meit mitzvah, what's a meit mitzvah? That's someone who has nobody to bury them. You might have thought maybe you can't become impure. Talmud lomar ula achoto. What does that teach you, lachoto? Lachoto deino mitameh. To your sister you can't because someone else can deal with it. Aval mitamehu lemeit mitzvah. But a meit mitzvah that there's nobody to deal with, so that you would have to do. Obviously, if your sister is a meit mitzvah, there's no one that's dealing with her burial, then obviously you have to. Okay, but we're talking about a meit mitzvah, right? If it's a sister who someone else can, then you don't become impure. But a meit mitzvah, yes, you do. Now, but going back, we have this contradiction. One source says an onen can't eat the Pesach. One says an onen can't eat the Pesach. What must be the distinction? Here comes the Gemara to say, this proves a biased distinction. Kan shmamina, lav shmamina. Is it not to infer from here? Kan kodem chatzot, kan la'achar chatzot. What's the distinction? If it happened before chatzot, the person died, then no obligation for Pesach. Aninu came before Pesach. So therefore, aninut is first, and therefore you don't do the Korban Pesach. But if they died after Chatzot, when you already became obligated to bring the Korban Pesach, then we're going to say, it's already after Chatzot, you're already obligated to bring the Korban Pesach, you finish it, and only after you deal with the, then later you could become impure. So now they say, wait a minute. Okay, they want to reject this as being an answer. And they say, Mimai, maybe you got it all wrong. Maybe each baraitot reflects a different position. There's a machloket between Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Akiva about whether you have to become you have to become impure to your relatives. Is it an obligation? If my relatives die, do I have an obligation to become impure to them, meaning also deal with it, or not? Or if there's other people to do it, so let other people do it, I don't have to. So that's a machloket, Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Akiva, very interesting machloket. Ditanya, la yitama reshut, divrei Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Akiva omer chova. So Rabbi Shimon looks at that pasuk, that the Kohen is allowed to become impure to his sister, as if he wants to be. He doesn't have to be. So that's obviously not the Yosef Kohen source that said, you have to become impure to your sister. If he chooses, I'd rather do Pesach than become impure to my sister. And it sounds like we're talking about anybody, right? This would apply to a regular person, not just a Kohen. If there's a conflict between Pesach and relative, you can decide, I'd rather do the Korban Pesach and not become impure to my relative. And Rabbi Akiva says, what are you talking about? It's an obligation. You have to it's a Torah obligation to become impure to your relatives. So that overrides Korban Pesach. Do Korban Pesach at Pesach Sheni. So they say, okay, that's a nice resolution, and that would reject this proof for Abaye, that it's Kodem Chatzot, Achar Chatzot. The problem is that it can't possibly be true, and this is why we're going to read the entire Braita. There's no way you could say that second Braita, Lachoto, in the Nazir context, is according to Rabbi Yishmael, because, listen, Dereisha Da'i, Rabbi Akiva Katanela, because there's a whole slew of drashot on that pasuk and the pasuk before. And they're all said in the name of Rabbi Akiva. And this is the end of that whole slew of drashot. So you can't say this isn't Rabbi Akiva's position, because Rabbi Akiva is the author of that Braita. So it's a very obvious, no way is that source Rabbi Yishmael. Ditani, Rabbi Akiva Omer. Now here we're going to go through, this isn't important for our purposes. The only thing we're trying to establish here is that the author of the second Braita is Rabbi Akiva, and it's not Rabbi Yishmael like we just suggested, okay? And that's all we're bringing this for. And then it's going to reinstate this resolution to the contradiction between La Yitama and La Choto Drasha. The one is before Chatzot, one is after Chatzot, which is exactly how Abai resolved the contradiction between the two baraitot of Rabbi Shimon earlier. Before Chatzot, after Chatzot. Okay, that's all we're doing here. So now we're just going to say, oh, look, Rabbi Akiva is the author. And now we're going to read Nefesh. Okay, this is the pasuk before. Kol Yimei Hiziro LaHashem, all the days he's a Nazir to God. Al Nefesh Meit Lo Yavo. He cannot become impure to a Nefesh Meit, to a dead body. Now, we're going to darshan all these words. Nefesh, Elu HaKrovim, those are his relatives. Meit, Elu HaRechokim. Those are people not his relatives. Now you have to say, obviously if he's not mitami to his relatives, he can't be mitami even to people who are farther away, but we'll leave that aside for right now. Then, la'aviv eno mitame, we're now just darshaning all these words. His father, his mother, his brother, his sister. So now, each one is going to be a progression. We're going to start with a basic Nazir, then we're going to do a Nazir who's a Kohen, then we're going to do a Nazir who's a Kohen Gadol, and then we're going to do a person on their way to do the Korban Pesach. So those are the four drashot on Aviv, Imo, Achiv, and Achoto. La'aviv eno metameh, aval metamehu l'meit mitzvah. So not the father, but a Nazir can become impure to a meit mitzvah. Li'imo, what's this coming to teach? Well, haya kohen v'hu Nazir. If he wasn't only a Nazir, but also a Kohen, still li'imo hu de'eno metameh, aval metamehu l'meit mitzvah. Now you might have thought, once he's also a Kohen and also a Nazir, maybe he can't be metameh to a meit mitzvah. No. Only to his mother, but yes to a meit mitzvah. Le'achiv, to his brother. What's this extra word for? She'im haya kohen gadol v'hu Nazir. Okay, here we're adding. Not only was he a Kohen, he was the Kohen Gadol, and he was a Nazir. Now, here you would think, really, maybe you can't become impure to meit mitzvah, but no. La'achivu de'eno matameh, can't be tameh to his brother, aval matameh u'lemeit mitzvah, but you still could be matameh to a meit mitzvah. And now we get to Lachoto Drasha. Now I'm going to read it like Tosfot, that we're not talking anymore about a Nazir and a Kohen Gadol, but now we're just talking about anybody, even though, again, the context is Nazir, and we did a build-up, and there's a bit of a difficulty with Tosfot, but there's a bit of a difficulty if you don't go with Tosfot. So anyway, la'achoto matamul lamal sharei ala. Now this we know already. We just learned this. Harei shalach l'shchot pischo v'lamul b'no v'shama shavet lomeid. So we have someone on their way to do these two very important mitzvot. They hear somebody died of their family. Yachol yitama. You might have thought, well, you can become tamei. They're your relatives. Amarta lo yitamei. But they say no. It said lo yitama. Yachol kishem she'em mitamei lachoto kachem mitamei l'meit mitzvah. Now, just to be clear, the main purpose of that baraitot was not why we brought it. The main purpose of that baraitot is to say, in all these cases, meit mitzvah trumps everything. It trumps a nazir, it trumps a nazir as a kohen, it trumps a nazir as a kohen gadol, and it trumps someone who's on their way to the korban pesach. But the main point for our purposes was the fact that you cannot become impure to your relative to do the korban pesach. Meaning you do the korban pesach even though you're an onen, and that was the whole issue why we got into this problem, because the other source says no, you go do the korban pesach even though you're an onen. So again, I'm sorry, you don't do the korban pesach, you actually become impure to your relative, and you don't do the korban pesach. So the way to resolve it was kodem chatzot la'achar chatzot, and even though they tried to say maybe one's Rabbi Akiva, one's Rabbi Shimon, do you have an obligation, or is it just optional to be mitami to your relatives? We can't explain it that way because the whole baraitot was said in the name of Rabbi Akiva. Okay, so this is all to support Abaye's response, that meit la'achar chatzot and meit kodem chatzot. Again, let's just review. If the person died after midday, when already the obligation for Pesach kicked in, then Pesach comes first and you do the Pesach instead of aninut. If the aninut kicked in first, before the obligation for Pesach, because the person died before midday of Erev Pesach, right? Because remember, midday is when you start doing the sacrifice and when the obligation kicks in. Then aninut comes first, and then you don't do the korban pesach. And that's how we resolve the two sources of Rabbi Yishmael. Does the onen eat the pesach or not eat the pesach? Now we're turning to Amabet, and we're getting to the fifth answer, Rava. And from here, we're going to have a tangent, and then a tangent on the tangent. That's going to be the rest of our daf. Rava Amar, Idi v'idi achar chatzot. He says, no, both are after chatzot. Okay? We're talking, okay, and even if you died after chatzot, the person, still there's going to be a case when you bring the korban pesach and where you eat it, and the other case where you don't eat it. V'lo kasha. Kan, what's the difference then? Kan kodem sheshachatu v'zarku alav. Kan la'achar sheshachatu v'zarku alav. It's not did the obligation kick in yet. Did they actually slaughter your korban pesach and sprinkle the blood, and only then you found out about your relative, or before? So, if it's before, let's say, okay, so midday kicks in, your relative hasn't died yet, but you haven't yet brought your korban pesach, and then your relative dies. So if they haven't slaughtered your korban pesach and they haven't sprinkled the blood, remember they would do it in groups, and you were registered for a korban. If your korban hadn't been slaughtered yet and the blood hadn't been sprinkled, then we say, okay, you can't eat the kudshim. You're not part of this korban. But if they already slaughtered and sprinkled the blood, then you finish the job, okay? You know, say finish the job, okay? You started it. They already slaughtered it for you, so you eat the korban pesach. Now, Rav Ada bar Matna, this is at the top of the second side of the study guide, asks the difficulty on this. Rav Ada bar Matna says to Amar le Rav Ada bar Matna le Rava, wait a minute. Achar sheshachatu v'zarku etamo, mai dahava hava. I'm going to use this term twice today, but in this one it means what was. In other words, if let's say it's Erev Pesach, okay, chatzot kicks in. I'm part of this korban pesach, and I do everything the way I'm supposed to, right? I'm part of this group. They slaughter the korban pesach, they sprinkle the blood, and then all of a sudden I hear someone died. Now what Rav is saying is, I can eat the korban pesach that night even though I'm an onen. But comes Rav Ada bar Ava and says, what are you talking about? I already fulfilled my obligation just by being counted in this. Like, what's the main part of the sacrifice? The slaughtering and the sprinkling of the blood. That's done already. So what's done is done, and why should we allow me now to eat the korban pesach? I don't need to eat it. To which, this is going to lead to our whole next sugya, Amar le Ravina, achila pesach ma'akva miderabba bar Rav Huna. Ravina says, what do you mean? You can't fulfill your obligation for the korban pesach unless you eat it. It's not enough to just slaughter and sprinkle the blood. You have to eat the korban pesach the night of Pesach. So, and how do we know that? From Rabbi bar Rav Huna. Now, how we know Rabbi Rav Huna says, we're going to have to figure that out. That's going to lead us to the whole next sugya. But take it for right now as a given. According to Rabbi bar Rav Huna, you have to eat the Pesach. So if they already slaughtered and sprinkled the blood, you're already part of this korban, so you got to finish. Okay? And finishing means eating. If you don't eat, it's not going to work. So but if they haven't slaughtered it yet, then you don't. And again, that goes back to the resolution, to which Rava, after Rav Ada questioned him and Rav Huna responded, Rava just adds in his last words in this argument, he says to Rav Ada, Tzayimai dekamar lach rabach. Okay, go listen to what your rabbi said. In other words, you raised a difficulty on me, your rabbi, Rav Huna, answered, well, go listen to what your rabbi said, meaning I'm with Rav Huna on his answer to your difficulty against me. Okay, that was just a small point. Now we want to know, what is Rabbi bar Rav Huna? Where do we see that Rabbi bar Rav Huna says, V'achila Pesach ma'akva? We're going to see he never uses those words, okay, just to be clear. But it's very clear from something he says, from a resolution to a different contradiction. It's very clear that he thinks, as part of the sacrificing of the Pesach, you have to eat it, okay? So, and not surprisingly, we're still on our topic of aninut. Okay, so we're going to bring a contradiction. This time it's not two different baraitot. It's the same baraitot. The first part contradicts the second part. So we're on our first tangent. We're going to tangent off of this in a little while, but right now we're on the first tangent. So the tangent is we want to figure out, again, Rava resolved the contradiction between, again, first baraitot of Rabbi Shimon, second baraitot of Rabbi Shimon, does the onen eat the Pesach, not eat the Pesach, by saying it's after they sprinkle the blood versus it's before they sprinkle the blood, okay? That distinction is clear, or Rava is supported by Rabbi bar Rav Huna, who says, well, if they already slaughtered, you have to eat it, because to fulfill your obligation, you have to eat the Pesach. So here comes our contradiction. Ditanya, Yom Shmu'ah ki Yom Kfura limitzvat shiv'a u'shloshim u'lachila psachim ki Yom likut atzamot. What is a Yom Shmu'ah? This is something that's a little less common in our day, but I would say at the time of the Holocaust it was very common, which is, let's say your relative dies and they get buried and you only find out about it later. Okay, because let's say in the Holocaust, right, unfortunately we found out only much later, although there maybe it's not the same thing exactly because they weren't necessarily really properly buried. But when you find out much later, right, usually we talk about aninut is the day of the death. Here you're saying you find out about the death much, much later. So in those days, it was probably somewhat common, somewhat not common, because it was probably somewhat not common because most people probably lived in the same villages as their family members. But if a family member moved out to a different city, it was very unlikely that you were going to hear about their death till much later because word didn't travel very fast. So let's say someone's living in a city, they get buried, and the relative living somewhere else only finds out much later. So the day they hear is a little bit like the day of death, but or the day of burial, okay? A little bit like the day of likut atzamot. What's likut atzamot? If you remember the ancient burial, they would first put there were two stages. Likut atzamot was where they would gather the bones after the bones had disintegrated, and then they would bury them. So that day has a certain status, which is that you can actually eat the Pesach on that day. You're an onen of a different status, okay? The day of likut atzamot, there's certain things that kick in, but you can actually eat korbanot, okay? You can eat kodshim. So the Yom Shmu'ah, if somebody finds out about the relative died later, it's like Yom Kfura, l'mitzvat shiva u'shloshim. So you sit shiva, you sit shloshim from the day you heard. Everything starts that day. But you can eat psachim that night, because it's ki yom likut atzamot achila psachim. Okay, now what sounds very clear from there? If we treated it like the day of burial, you can't eat the Pesach, right? So what do you see from here? The day of burial, again, which is not the day of death, it's the day of burial. So it could be the day after, let's say, the day of death. Sounds like you can't eat kodshim then. You can't eat the Pesach then. Okay? Now, the last line of that baraitot, right after that, it says, echad zeh v'echad zeh, but this and that. Now, what is this and that? Well, we said the Yom Shmu'ah is like a day of burial, for one thing, and like the day of gathering the bones for eating the Pesach, meaning you can't eat the Pesach. But both this and that, which sounds like the day of burial and the day of likut atzamot, tover ve'ochel b'kodashim la'erev. You can't eat kodshim at night. Now there's a complete contradiction, because we just said for psachim you can eat the Pesach on Yom HaShmu'ah because it's like the day they gather the bones. But it's not like the day of the burial. It sounds like the day of the burial you can't eat the Pesach. And the second line of the baraitot says, you can actually eat any sacrifices. Forget about the Pesach. You can eat any sacrifices at night, even on the day of the burial. So that's a complete contradiction. So we're going to have 3 resolutions to this contradiction, and the third is the one we're looking for, which is Rav Huna. Okay, so let's just read inside. I'm sorry, the second one. We're going to have 3, and the second one is the one we're looking at. So how do we resolve it? So Hagufa Kasha, let's just read it inside. They're going to explain. This Braita completely contradicts itself. Now we're going to just review what I just said. Amarta Yom Shmu'a ki Yom Kfura le'mitzvat Sheva u'Shloshim. Ulachia Pesachim ki Yom Likudat Tzemot. Right? We said the day you hear is like the day of burial for Shiva and Shloshim, but not like the day of burial for Pesach, because for Pesach you can eat the Pesach because it's like the day of gathering the bones. Michla, from there you can infer the Yom Kfura filu le'erev nami lo achil. It sounds like the day of burial you can't eat that night, and yet in the second part of the Braita Hadar Taneh echad ze v'echad ze toveh v'ocheh b'kodashim la'erev. Right? Both the day of burial and the day of gathering the bones, you can eat kachim in the evening. So Rav Chisda, okay, first resolution which isn't relevant to us right now, Tanaihi, he says, each part of the Braita reflects a different position. Okay, even though it sounded like one continuum, he says one is Rebbe, one is the rabbis. Okay, if you want to know that machloket, I started here because the Gemara is going to come back to it later. That's going to be our tangent on the tangent. We're going to have a whole discussion, another 3 different opinions, one of them being the one that matches Rav Chisda here, which is proving this is a machloket tanaim. Whether the day of burial you can eat kachim at night or you can't. We're going to get back to that. So put that aside for right now. That's why I said this stuff is very confusing, because they keep opening things and then, okay. Rabbi Rav Huna amar lo kasha. כאן ששמע שמועה על מתו סמוך לשקיעת החמה, וכן שלקטו לו סמוך לשקיעת החמה, וכן שמת לו מת וקברו סמוך לשקיעת החמה, וכאן לאחר שקיעת החמה. Okay, so he says like this. When it says you can eat kachim at night, what are they talking about? He's going to make a new distinction that we haven't seen yet. If the person died before shkia or after shkia. Okay? Now we're going to say like this. If you heard that, okay, now he went through 3 cases where we're going to say when it says you can eat kachim at night, it's if you heard your person died on the day that you heard, right, your person died before shkia. Or you heard, or liktulo atzamot, we did the gathering of the bones before shkiat hachama, or even if a person dies and they buried him before shkiat hachama. If everything was done before shkia, now this is yom kfura, not yom mita, the day of death. Remember, we learned no matter what, it's either doraita or drabanan. Oninuk goes into the night, but the day of the burial doesn't continue into the night. Okay, as long as the burial or the shmua that you heard or the bones were collected and put away, right, and buried, all of that happened before shkia, then you can eat kachim that night. If all of this happened after shkia, then of course, right, you were in aninut, they didn't deal with the burial yet, or you heard about the relative at night, well, of course you can't eat kachim that night. And that's the way Rav Huna resolves this. Now, Gemara asks, now remember, we're looking for what? We're looking for Rav Huna saying that eating the Pesach is essential. Now, lachar shkiat hachama, mai dahava hava. Now wait a minute. If we say the Yom Kippur you can't eat the Pesach, what does it matter? If you're on your Dalid, right, and they sacrifice the Pesach for you, your relative hasn't died yet, or you didn't, right? It's the Yom Kippur we're talking about. So the relative hasn't been buried, okay? But let's say they didn't even die yet. Okay, because let's say you only heard about it later, right? So Yom HaShmuah, right, happens after Shkia. Now, after Shkia of, right, we're now in Tet Vav. We're in Pesach night. Now you're done with your Dalid. Your Dalid's over. Which means they slaughtered the Pesach for you, they sprinkled the blood. So aren't you done? Didn't you fulfill your obligation already? Why does it matter to say it's Ki Yom Kfura and you can't eat the Pesach? Who cares if you can't eat the Pesach? You already fulfilled your obligation. No, what he wants to tell you is you didn't fulfill your Pesach, right? If your Yom Shmuah, we're going to call it Likud Atzamot, and you can actually eat your Pesach. Okay, actually, this is the point he wants to make. Sorry, I want to clarify it. If you say Yom HaShmuah is like Yom Likud Atzamot L'Achila Pesachim, why did they need to tell you that? You already fulfilled your obligation anyway, because if you only hear after Shkia, then you already fulfilled your obligation. Obviously not, because he's saying you can still eat the Pesach even though you found out only now, because we're going to treat it like Yom Likud Atzamot. If we treated it like Yom Kfura and it happened after Shkia, of course we wouldn't allow you to eat. But because we're treating it like Yom Likudat Tzama, we're going to allow you to eat. Why? Because you won't fulfill your Korban Pesach if you don't eat. Otherwise, we just say, don't eat. You already did the sprinkling of the blood. You already slaughtered. Everything's done. So it must be that you need to eat the Pesach. Okay? And that's what we were looking for in Rav Huna. Now, Rav Ashi Amar, my echad zevi echad zeh. He has a completely different way of resolving this contradiction. Okay, we could have stopped here, but we're not because we're already giving the three resolutions to this contradiction. He says, wait a minute, you thought that second part of the baraitot was saying, echad zevi echad zeh, yom kfura and yom likudat tzama, you can eat kachim, and it totally contradicts the first part of the baraitot. He says, no, hachi kamar. Echad yom hashmua, ve'echad yom likud, tovel v'opel b'kodashim la'erev. When it says this and that means the day you hear and the day of the collecting of the bones, not the day of the burial. You thought it was referring to the day of burial. It's not. The day of burial, of course you can't eat kachim. When it says you can eat kachim, it was saying, okay, now let's read it. The Yom Shmuah is like Yom Likudat Tzama for Pesachim, and then it's basically saying, and by the way, not just Pesach, you can eat kachim also on both those days. But the Gemara doesn't like this resolution. Hadrav Ashi Bedutehi, it's a mistake, it's wrong, he made this up. Because Michte, Allah Kai, if it was just a continuation of that previous sentence, it would have said, and both of them, right, this and this, not Echad Zevi Echad Zeh. Echad Zevi Echad Zeh sounds much more like we're going back to something we said earlier. It could have just said Zev Zeh without the words Echad and Echad. In fact, it says Zev Zeh Mebaile, Allah Shmamina Bedutehi, and therefore it really doesn't sound like it's talking about the Yom HaShmuah and the Yom Likudat Tzamot, and therefore reject it. Okay. Now we have to finish up with, it's a bit of a long finishing up, with where I start here. We got to this whole contradiction in this baraitot because we wanted to find Rav Huna where he said you have to eat the Korban Pesach, right? That's part of the obligation. You don't fulfill it unless you eat it, and that we found in this contradiction. But before that, Rav Chisda said the way to resolve this contradiction is to say it's machloket tanaim. So now we have to figure out where's this machloket tanaim. We're going to bring a machloket. We're going to actually bring 3 different explanations to the machloket. You could even maybe say 4, because right away from the get-go, they're going to reject the first one. Okay? So I didn't even count that as 1, but we're going to read right now. Umay tonight, Tanya. Now we're going to have another baraitot, which also obviously relates to our topic. Again, we're still struggling with when does aninut go, okay? Till when does aninut end? Kol hayom, till the end of the day. Rebbe Omer, kozman shelo nikbar, until the burial. Now this is strange, because none of them says, by the way, it goes to the night, even though we saw that aninut goes into the night. And when did anyone ever say it stops at the burial? So, b'mayaskina, what are we talking about? Ilema b'yom hamitah, if we're talking about the day of death, for sure that doesn't work, because we saw this machloket Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Yehuda, is the nighttime that goes after the day of the death, is that to oraita or to Rabbanan? But everyone thinks at least it's to Rabbanan. Here it sounds like nobody says that. And Vitu, Rabbi Omer Kozman Shalonik Bar, Hakvaro Ishterele, Umikadalele Vacharita Yomar, starting with that pasuk again, everyone agrees Acharita Yomar, the whole day for sure is a problem. So nobody thinks that it ends at the burial. Aninut goes all the way until the end of the day, until at least Shkia, if not the whole night. So it can't possibly be the Yom of Death, so the day of death, so they completely reject that. So here comes our first explanation. Amar Rav Sheshet, a Yom Kfuakai. We're obviously talking about the day of the burial. And then we have this machloket, the day of the burial, does it end at the end of that day, at Shkia, and not go into the night? And Rebbe says, no, it actually ends at the burial. We haven't seen that opinion yet, right? This is the first time we're seeing that. Now, Matkifla Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef said, what are you talking about? No way. Elahad katane hashomea meito k'melaket atzamot v'ochel b'chodashim la'erev michlal d'yom ha'kfura afilu la'erev nami lo achil hamane. The baraitot we just saw, what did it say? If you hear about your relative, what do we say? You can eat kachim at night because it's like a day you collect bones. If it was like the day of Kfura, now notice it said Kfura, burial, it didn't say the day of death. If it was the day of death, you couldn't eat kachim at night. Now, nobody, according to here, holds that on the day of, if you go with Rav Sheshet, it's talking about the day of burial, one says it continues to the end of the day, and one says it continues till the burial. Nobody thinks it goes at night, and that source clearly said that Yom Kfura, you can't eat kachim at night, and that goes according to nobody here, so that can't possibly be the way to read it. So that answer is rejected. Rav Yosef says, he adds, When it says kol hayom, we mean all the day, meaning the whole day, including the night. Okay? Rebbe Omer kozman shelo nikbal. That's only true if you haven't buried. That will go to the night, because we'll wait till the next day. Aval nikbar, but if you bury the person below leilo, then it ends at sunset. And now we have a pretty good explanation. That fits with things we saw before. That does aninut of the day of burial go even into the night, or does it not? But Rav Yirmiyah didn't like this. Amar Kamed Rabbi Yirmiyah. Amar, if you remember, Rabbi Yirmiyah is sometimes kind of chutzpahdik. He says, Gavar Rabbi Rav Yosef Lemahachi, a great rabbi like Rav Yosef said this? No way, no how. How could he possibly say this? This is completely wrong, and he's going to base it on a different machlokah we see between Rebbe and the rabbis. He says, Lema de Rebbe Lekula, what he says here, Rebbe's the one who's mekel, who says it doesn't go into the night. But that's completely not what it says here in this braita. A different braita says, till when does aninut end? Until the right, it could, if you don't bury the person up to 10 days, the aninut continues. And Rashi points out here, even into the night. Chachamim, which is completely the opposite of what we just said he said. And the rabbis say, the rabbis are the lenient ones here. They say, no, just the day. In other words, let's say it's up to 10 days. Just the day of the burial, but not into the night. And that's completely opposite the way we just said. So Rabbi Yirmiyah rejects, and now we're finally getting to our Rav Chisda. Okay, now it's not in the name of Rav Chisda, but when Rav Chisda said before, now let's just remember. Okay, I put it at the bottom here. We had this contradiction in the previous sugya that on the Yom Kvura you can't eat kachim at all. And the other said the day of the burial you can eat kachim at night. Okay? Now we're going to see that that's the machloket between Rebbe and the rabbis according to Rabbi Yirmiyah. Okay? Can you eat kachim the day of the burial or can't you? And that's going to match the braita we just saw a second ago. Elatar tzachi. Amatayu mitonein alav. Kol oto hayom below leilo, according to the rabbis. Rebbe Omer kozman shelo nikbar. Vim nikbar tofes leilo, which matches this braita. In other words, as what we just read, Rebbe kozman she'eno nikbar afilu mikam v'ad asara yamim. If you push off the burial, you have to go with the night as well. And if you didn't, you do, right? And the rabbis say, no. If you push off the burial, it's just the day of the burial, and then the night after is not a problem. And that, again, can you eat kachim at night after the day of burial? That's exactly the contradiction we saw before. So we're going to go back to this previous contradiction, and when we said, Rav Chisda said it's a machloket tanaim, one is Rebbe, one is the rabbis. Can you eat after the day of Kvura? Can you not? That's a machloket. Okay, now, last point. Amruah kamei de Rava. They brought this in front of Rava. Mida ka'amar Rebbe yom kvura tofes lo mida Rabbanan michlal di yom mita tofes lo leilo midoraita. V'savar Rebbe anilut laila doraita. Wait a minute. They said, how could you possibly say that Rebbe's machmir here and makes the night of burial also onen? Because why? They're assuming right now, if he says that the night after burial is rabbinic, then it must be, why are we going to be machmir on the night of burial? Because the night after the day of death must be Torah, right? We have Torah obligation the night after the burial. The night after the death. Therefore, on the burial night, we're going to be machmir midrabanan and also make that night an issue. But that would mean that Rebbe holds the aninut, the first night is doraita, like Rabbi Yehuda and not like Rabbi Shimon. But that's not true. That's not what Rebbe holds. V'hatanya hein hayom. Okay, this is back to that pasuk about Aaron. He said today. Now the drasha is ani hayom asur v'layla mutar. For me, I can't eat during the day, but I actually am allowed to eat at night. But lidorot, for generations, meaning in the future though, any other kohanim, bein b'yom bein b'layla asur, divrei Rabbi Yehuda. They're going to be forbidden even at night to eat kachim. And Rebbe Omer, aninut laila eina midivrei Torah ela midivrei sofrim. And Rebbe says, what are you talking about? Aninut laila for generations is not even from the Torah, it's only rabbinic. So here you see, he holds that even the day after the death is only rabbinic. And that seems to contradict this. Now again, why does it contradict? Because they're assuming if he's machmir on the day of burial, midrabanan, it must be, it's because Yom HaMita is Torah law. To which the rabbis answer very simply, no. Very powerful line, which we don't have time to really talk about now, but really it's rabbinic, the night after the onen, but after the day of death, but they stretched it also to the day of burial because sometimes the rabbis strengthen their words as if they're words of Torah. Okay, the rabbis have the power to say what we say is like Torah law, and we can be strict and severe. This is Yoter Mishal Torah, but Tosfos says it's not more than, it's equal to in this case. Sometimes it's more than. In this case, it's just equal. Treated it as if it was Torah law, even though it's not really Torah law. And that resolves that. Anyway, back to a really short summary of our daf, because I've been summarizing all along. We had a contradiction between two baraitot of Rabbi Shimon. He said the opposite things about whether an onen can eat the Pesach or not. We have 5 resolutions, 3 of them we dealt with today. We had a difficulty on the first and knocked it out. We had on number 3 and knocked it out. We had Abaye, we brought a proof to his distinction. And then Rava's distinction we had to explain based on Rav Huna. In explaining Rav Huna, we also came across Rav Chisda, who dealt with that contradiction in a different way. And for that, we had to explain how does he say, where does he get that there's a machloket tanaim specifically on this issue. And that, again, depends on, there were 3 ways to understand the machloket there. Again, one got rejected, but the other 2 still stand, Rav Yosef's and Rabbi Yirmiyah's. And Rav Chisda fits in with Rabbi Yirmiyah's explanation of the machloket Rebbe and the rabbis, and that fits into the exact debate between the first part of that baraitot and the second part of that baraitot that was earlier. And with that, we finish our complicated daf, wishing everyone a good day.